Welcome back to the Book of Revelation, Historicist View. We are Lebanon Springs House, and this is part 29, Babylon Bankrupted. I had intended to cover both chapters 17 and 18 in today's video, but time being what it is, and the events in the world happening so quickly around us, I thought it best to release it in two parts. So this will be part A, and today we're going to cover chapter 17, the whore and the beast. And in another video that's already in the making, we're going to focus on Babylon's fall. But first, as always, we're going to quickly recap our last video where we saw the geopolitical, religious, and cultural, societal earthquake that literally swept the entire world. And it ushered in giant hailstones which are already sweeping away the lies that have kept us bound in our grave clothes, not unlike those that had to be removed from Lazarus when he was resurrected from the dead. I hope in earnest that we truly are experiencing the Great Reformation 201. It seems more than possible to me, especially given where we are in this book of the Revelation. Messiah is about to return. Literally, that's all we're waiting for now. We aren't waiting for this book to begin. The seals have been opened. The trumpets have been blown, and yes, I believe all of the bowls have been poured out. And that brings us to the topic of today's video, the identity of all of the players in Satan's kingdom of darkness. Chapter 17 is going to sketch a portrait of the counterfeit church, sometimes referred to as Mystery Babylon, and it's going to leave no doubt, really, as to whom the object of Yahweh's wrath has been. Then chapter 18 will sketch a portrait of its fall, and we're going to ask again, is a worldwide economic crash being depicted? Well, if you've never even thought of chapter 18 as such before, you're really going to want to watch for our next video. I think you'll be surprised to find out how many have seen it just so. So with that as our backdrop, let's get started with the symbolism and the interpretation of the book of Revelations, chapter 17. Now, I think I said this last time that this chapter could be viewed as one of those parenthetical chapters, giving us a 30,000-foot view of Satan's entire kingdom. And of course, we'll focus on different parts of that throughout the prophecy today. But keep that in mind. This is a description of the entire kingdom, if you will. So beginning with the symbolism in the first two verses, we read, "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me," John is speaking. "Come hither, I will show unto you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." Now this Greek word whore is porne. Figuratively, it's an idolater, harlot, or whore. And we've touched on the fact that idolatry is nothing more than spiritual adultery, and that's going to figure prominently later on in the interpretation. The fact that the kings of the earth have participated in that fornication, along with the inhabitants of the earth, it links them as well with idolatry. Moving on to verses 3 and 4. "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." Now, in these passages, Messiah is describing two of the main characters in this chapter. Let's first point out the fact, though, that the Spirit carries John away into the wilderness, and we're going to address the possible significance of this later on, but I believe it, too, is central to the picture that's being painted here. It's not just a trivial detail. Next, John begins to describe the scarlet-colored beast, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. And this should sound familiar to us, but we shouldn't jump to any conclusions too soon. And then John begins to describe the woman sitting on that beast as being arrayed in purple and scarlet and holding this very conspicuous golden cup in her hand. Now, though the two main characters of these chapters are introduced in these passages, we're going to see several supporting actors, as I said earlier. They're going to be veiled, I think, by vague language, and that's just in keeping with the mystery of this book. But let's begin to massage the idea of this seven-headed, ten-horned beast of chapter 17 by first remembering the first of two beasts from chapter 13. And this is where John told us that he stood on the sand and saw this beast rise up out of the sea, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns, along with the name of blasphemy on his heads. This is without a doubt a picture of the beast from the sea, which we remember it's one of its head, the 7th head, represented the Roman Empire. And we were told in that narrative that it received the fatal head wound, which, being revived, represented the Holy Roman Empire. So you might think, why am I bringing up the beast from Revelation 13 when we're talking about the beast in chapter 17? And really it's because many of our historicist commentators want to make this one and the same beast. But does the book bear that out? We shall see. Moving on to verses 5 and 6. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. John says, I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Well, I wonder at the interpretation of the word admiration here, but we're going to get to that in just a bit. First thing to notice is that a name is written upon her forehead, and this should sound familiar as well. Remember the 144,000, the remnant, if you will, of the 12 tribes of Israel, being sealed with the name of their God upon their forehead. And this, is the fact that Messiah is not just revealing himself to John or to us through the revelation, but he's also unveiling the counterfeit at the same time, which is something only he could do. Now, when speaking of the names, Mr. Barnes believes that the word mystery wasn't actually a part of the name. It should probably be rendered, a mysterious name was written, or a name was written mysteriously. And that leaves us with the names Babylon the Great and Mother of Harlots and Abominations of the Earth. That's interesting, right? Because I can imagine most of us walk around thinking, I hope no one can read my thoughts. It would be very telling. Well, these are very telling words upon the forehead of this woman, and we'll see where that leads us in just a bit. But we also find a hint to the identity of this woman who is riding the beast, the fact that she is drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs, and this is a clear picture of the war waged against the saints by the papacy. Now remember, this is a parenthetical chapter, so it's giving us the overview. This has already happened, this war that the papacy waged against the saints, but now this is part of the picture, right? Part of the snapshot of this kingdom of darkness. And I hope that will become clear as we go along. The last thing I want to look at in these verses is the fact that John is admiring this woman, right? That Greek word is thalma, which can be translated as wonder or admiration, but the root of the word is to look closely at or to perceive. And I think the better picture is that of John's jaw dropping, maybe as he's scratching his head and thinking, what on earth am I seeing? And that's all I want to say right now. But again, in the interpretation portion, we're going to make more sense, I think, of what John is actually feeling when we connect some of the dots about this woman in the wilderness. And the angel said unto me in verse 7, Why did you marvel? I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this is the second time these heads and horns have been mentioned, but it will not be the last. Verse 8, The beast that you saw was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. So this is a very curious thing that Messiah is now telling us, right? That John's beast was and is not and shall ascend. And this probably sounds familiar to us as well, because in chapter 1 of the book of Revelation, verse 4, where John sees his vision of the glorified risen Lord, he says, from him which is and which was and which is to come. And then just a few verses later, we see it again. Says the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come. And even in chapter 4, verse 8, the Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. All three of these verses are attributing at least a very similar phrase to either the Lord God Almighty himself, that would be Yahweh sitting on his throne, or to Yeshua, Jesus Christ, as he opens his revelation to John. And I find it very interesting, really, the Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary, who we will cite today several times, has this take on it. The Hebrew tetragrammaton, or sacred four letters in Yehovah, no J in the Hebrew language, who is, who was, and who is to come, the believer's object of worship, has its contrasted counterpart in the beast, who was and is not and shall be present, the object of the earth's worship. You know, this commentary makes a lot of sense because, as we've said many times before, this counterfeiter has always tried to appear to be God to the world, to be Christ on earth. So no surprises here. And then we see the bottomless pit. We saw it opened at the fifth trumpet, unleashing Islam upon the world. And we're going to see it again in chapter 20, when Satan himself is bound in chains and thrown into this pit. But let me just now suggest that this is not a third occurrence of some event at the bottomless pit. I believe it's just referencing one of those two times that it is open in the book of Revelation. And that's a hint, I believe, about the identity of this beast. And this beast then going into perdition, that Greek word is apoleia, meaning ruin or loss, destruction. It can be die, perish, or waste. You know, this would seem to be telling us that whoever this beast is, he's going to come out of the bottomless pit and be destroyed. And that's going to be an important factor in determining who this chapter 17 beast is. And as if right on cue, verses 9 through 11 attempt to help answer that question. And here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goes into perdition. So if you're not particularly fond of solving riddles, this may be one of the reasons you've stayed clear from the book of Revelation. But we just have to remember that all of this is straightforward symbolism. And as you might imagine, this portion of the prophecy, like so many before it, has been greatly debated over the years. So when we get into the interpretation portion, we're going to speak to the differences of opinion on it, but I hope to bring some clarity to these pictures today. At this juncture, though, I do think it's important to revisit Daniel's 4 beasts, which was a model for the beast that we did see in chapter 13 earlier. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go back, deep into the book of Daniel, because we've already done that, really. But it is a quick reminder that Daniel sees 4 separate beasts in his vision, whereas John sees an amalgamation of these kingdoms in one beast. I also will note here, review, that in John's 7-headed beast, we still have Daniel's lion of Babylon, the bear of Persia, the 4 leopard heads representing the Grecian kingdom, which was partitioned into 4 quarters, if you remember, after Alexander died. And finally, the dreadful and terrible beast that neither Daniel nor John knew. Now, we can be fairly certain that this beast of Revelation chapter 13, the first beast introduced there, represents the Gentile kingdoms that Daniel saw that were going to rule the world, and again, more importantly, Israel. But it also depicted that the transformation that would take of that final kingdom when Rome falls. The question remains, however, is this the beast referred to in chapter 17? Now we're going to have to pick apart some of these clues that Messiah has given us if we're going to answer that question, and we're going to begin with the first line. Here is the mind which has wisdom. This is a subtle hint from Messiah, I believe, that caution should be taken against making assumptions too quickly. I mean, if this is the beast from chapter 13, which we've already seen, we're slightly familiar with it, why this clandestine clue? And then, of course, there are these hints regarding the 7 kings, 5 of which are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. And to top that off, this beast himself is an 8th king. When we get to the interpretation, we're going to try to see if this really fits the first beast, right? And if it doesn't, we have some issues to solve. And I believe it's going to become fairly easy if you'll just hang with me. Verses 12 and 14 tell us that these 10 horns are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Again, we see pictures that should sound very familiar when we think of that war, making the papacy making war with the saints. These horns are going to help, and that's going to be really important when we get to the interpretation portion. Now, these horns have been difficult for many to interpret, but I believe that's mainly because once you leave the rails of the historicist view, truly the tracks are hard to find. Verse 15 tells us, and he said unto me, the waters which you saw where the whore sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And we have already leaned heavily on this verse from the book of Revelation to confirm the symbolism of water. Whoever this woman is, she clearly rides roughshod over many people. And the 10 horns which you saw upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. Now, we have also referenced these verses before in this series, and I wonder if you can remember why we did so. It'll come back up later. The final verse in chapter 17 tells us, quote, the woman which you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. This verse, again, leaves no doubt as to the woman's identity. We don't even have to guess. And while verse 5 told us that one of the names etched on her forehead was Babylon the Great, we're now emphatically told that this woman is that great city. So I want to say Mystery Babylon, that's my name for who this whore is. But as we said in the beginning, that is the same as saying the counterfeit church. Now, we're going to hear me interchange several things. When I speak of spiritual Babylon, I'm really talking about the entire kingdom of Satan that is going to become very obvious from today's video, I hope. But this counterfeit church, being just a part of that kingdom, I believe, is who this woman is, who is riding this beast, who has the reins at the moment. And so we finally come to the interpretation portion of today's video. And the first thing that you need to know is that there is a general sense of agreement amongst historicists on these verses. That being said, there's also some variation on certain portions of the prophecy. And finally, There's a singular departure amongst our commentators from the established historicist view, one which I tend to gravitate towards, and I'll be sure to highlight those distinctions for you. So we're first going to look at the great whore, the name that Messiah gave to this woman, and on several occasions I have referred to her as the other woman. That will hopefully make sense in the larger picture. But historicists have seen this woman generally as the Latin Church or the Church of Rome, but also as the papacy, as regarded the head of that church in Rome, much like Messiah is the head of his body of believers referred to as the Christian church. Now, speaking of the grandeur of this woman's appearance, Adam Clarke tells us this strikingly represents the most pompous and costly manner in which the Latin Church has held forth to the nations the rites and ceremonies of its idolatrous and corrupt worship. Mr. Clarke has been very consistent with his portrayal of the Roman Church as the Latin Church throughout all of his commentaries, but make no mistake, they are one and the same. Albert Barnes and many others simply call it the Church of Rome, and he tells us the image here is that of papal Rome, represented as an abandoned woman in gorgeous attire, alluring by her arts the nations of the earth. He says it is a remarkable fact, most remarkable, that the papacy, as if designing to furnish a fulfillment of this prophecy, has chosen to represent itself most precisely in this manner. John Gill is going to weigh in. He says, this is none other than Rome papal, and she is called a great one because of the largeness of the papal see and because of the multitude of persons, the kings of the earth and the inhabitants of it, with whom the Romish Antichrist has committed spiritual fornication or idolatry. Next, Matthew Henry is going to touch on the possibility that the title, the other woman, might be more appropriate than first thought. He says a whore in this passage is one that is married and has been false to her husband's bed, has forsaken the guide of her youth, and broken the covenant of God, the parent and nurse of all false religion and filthy conversation. This scenario really shouldn't be a strange one to Bible students. The book of Isaiah, in chapter 3, I believe, we are told that Israel is described as playing the harlot, arrayed in festal apparel and jewelry. The picture is one of spiritual adultery, which, as we've said before, is simply idolatry. So this begs the question, really, has this woman ever been married to Yahweh? The Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary further links this picture to popes and cardinals when they tell us the color scarlet, it is remarkable, is that reserved for popes and cardinals. Paul II made it penal for anyone but cardinals to wear hats of scarlet. And next, when quoting Roger Hovden, they say, the harlot arrayed in gold is the Church of Rome. Whenever and wherever the church, instead of being clothed with the Son of Heaven, is arrayed in earthly, meretricious gauds, compromising the truth of God through fear or flattery of the world's power, science, or wealth, she becomes the harlot seated on the beast. Here we see the suggestion, maybe a hint, that this woman isn't just a different character in the book of Revelation. It's possible that we're seeing what they call a character arc, someone transforming from a good character to a bad one in the narrative, and hence the suggestion that this woman riding the beast is the true church gone apostate. It's a subtle nuance, but it is an important one, I think. This woman, the Church of Rome, perhaps beginning well, but becoming apostate, led by its head, the office of the papacy, much like, as I've said before, Messiah represents and leads his bride. So if we have correctly connected some of these dots, we can dispense with the new symbolism of a woman and state her true identity. She's the beast of the earth, which is, of course, the papacy. But that still leaves us asking, who is this scarlet beast? Well, the next descriptor of this woman is the fact that she is a woman in the wilderness. And historically, the view has been, of the wilderness has been identified as either the literal ruinous countryside of Rome, or the Gentile world itself, and then again, the wilderness representing the dry and barren landscape of the true church falling away. And Albert Barnes makes the case of the first possibility. On this supposition, as the interpretation has led us to believe all along, that this refers to papal Rome, may not the propriety of this be seen in the condition of Rome and the adjacent country at the rise of the papal power? And then he quotes Edward Gibbons from The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. We might remember that from early on in this book. Rome had reached about the close of the 6th century, the lowest period of her depression. By the removal of the seat of empire and the successive loss of the provinces, the sources of public and private opulence were exhausted. The lofty tree under whose shade the nations of the earth had reposed was deprived of its leaves and branches, and the sapless trunk was left to wither on the ground. Mr. Barnes says the Campagna of Rome was speedily reduced to the stale of a dreary wilderness in which the land is barren, the waters are impure, and the air is infectious. Mr. Barnes is speaking here, of course, about literal Rome, and he's probably speaking of the time when those northern hordes invaded and literally desolated the entire area. But we have to remember that literal Rome is only a type, or it's just a type of spiritual Babylon. So keep that in your mind. I don't believe that he's just speaking about the ruinous countryside of literal Rome, but that may be what was happening, of course, at the same time. Again, remember this chapter is not talking about one of the judgments. We're seeing an overview of Satan's kingdom. In fact, I believe this is a composite picture throughout all of time. John isn't giving us, again, this play-by-play commentary. He's incorporating all of the various henchmen, shall we say, that have been used by the dragon. I think that's critical in making these symbols work. I don't think any new actors are being introduced here. We're just going to have to simply determine who these henchmen are. And, this picture is not even given to us until the end of the book of Revelation. In other words, there aren't any more scenarios to fulfill or be played out, short of Babylon's fall in the next chapter, and of course that Gog and Magog war at the end of the millennium. So, if the futurist view is correct, right, it would be incumbent upon us to find modern day countries or people groups to fulfill all of these roles. But if the historicist view is correct, the nations that the Bible has already introduced up to this point should be sufficient. And I think that's what we're going to find today. Next, John Gill is going to suggest the wilderness represents the Gentile world in general. The Gentile world is often in the prophecies of the Old Testament called a wilderness. The Romish church having much of heathen worship and heathen customs and practices in it, hence its votaries are called Gentiles. Even though he's using the word Gentile world, clearly he's applying that picture to the Church of Rome because of the practices that, by the way, they still purport today. And if you remember when we talked about the court of the Gentiles, which John was not to measure when he measured the temple, oh gosh, that's going back a while, isn't it? Because the Gentiles were going to trample the holy city for 42 months. So this really isn't a stretch to consider the Church of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, as being, at least from Yahweh's perspective, Gentile. It's no part of the bride of Messiah. And those are strong words, but I believe they are his words. But it's Adam Clarke who's going to superimpose these details over the true church, which became apostate, much like that of old Israel. This wilderness into which the apostle was carried is the desolate state of the true church of Christ in one of the wings of the once mighty Roman Empire. It was truly an awful sight, a terrible desert, a waste, howling wilderness, to which the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown adds force by referencing the first woman John saw in the wilderness, which we identified as Israel, who had fled from the presence of the dragon then he went after her children, right, who kept the commandments of God and held the testimony of Yeshua. They say contrast her, the woman in Revelation 12, that would be Israel, as having a place in the wilderness world, but not a home, a sojourner here looking for the city to come. Only now, the contrary, this woman is contented to have her portion in this moral wilderness. Well, I agree with this commentary. I think something has drastically changed, and I have to wonder if this isn't why John's jaw has dropped. He's not admiring her. He's really wondering, what in the world happened to you? Let's look at another descriptor of this woman, the cup that she is holding, full of abominations and fornication. This has traditionally been seen by the church as one of three possibilities: either the rites and ceremonies of the Roman Catholic Church, her intoxicating allurements, or simply the blood of the saints and martyrs. And John Gill is going to lead this time with the argument that Rome's idolatrous practices are what is being alluded to. And this, being a golden cup, may design the external luster and splendor of the worship of the Church of Rome, by which many have been drawn into a compliance with it, which is attended with many abominable, filthy, and idolatrous practices. But Mr. Barnes sees it a bit more tainted than that. He thinks of pharmakia, or sorceries. He says the meaning here is that it seemed to be a cup filled with wine, but it was in fact a cup full of all abominable drugs, leading to all kinds of corruption. Let me just point out the fact that that is a real word used in the very next chapter in verse 23. Pharmakia, as I said, it's where we get our modern word pharmacy, and it means medication, magic, or witchcraft. And so now we know why it was used, right? All of these lying signs and wonders that the papacy performed, some quite possibly being from the occult. But it's Matthew Henry whom I believe best interprets what this woman is drinking when speaking of her diet. She satiated herself with the blood of the saints and martyrs of Jesus. She drank their blood with such greediness that she intoxicated herself with it. She was satiated, but never satisfied. In fact, the text itself tells us this very thing. She was drunk on the blood of the saints and martyrs. Now, the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary further suggests that Rome didn't even try to hide these connections. They tell us instead of drinking her Lord's cup of suffering, she has a cup full of abominations and filthinesses. They say Rome, in her medals, represents herself, holding a cup with the self-condemning inscription, Sedet super universum, being translated, the world is her seat. So now we just have to interpret the symbols of this scarlet beast. And many, if not most, historicist commentators see this scarlet beast, as I've said before, as the beast from the sea. That is pagan Rome becoming papal Rome. And Albert Barnes begins, he says, the beast here referred to is the same that is mentioned in Revelation chapter 13. That is, there was one great formidable power, having essentially the same origin, though manifested under somewhat different modifications, to one and all of which might, in their different manifestations, be given the same name, the beast. Well, I can go along with some of what Mr. Barnes is saying here because really the general symbolism is similar. But as we'll see later, this is where I part ways with historicists. John Gill, in his commentary, agrees with Mr. Barnes about the identity of this beast. He says, in short, the meaning is that this beast was the Roman Empire as pagan, described with 7 heads and 10 horns with crowns on the heads, but is not as yet, in the Apostle John's time, as papal. Well, you really can't argue with Mr. Gill on this point either. It is true that at the time John received the revelation, pagan Rome had not yet morphed into papal Rome. However, none of Revelation had been rolled out at that point, so I don't think that can stand on its own as evidence that they have correctly identified this beast. Let's continue. Matthew Henry adds his 2 cents. He says, the beast was and is not and yet is. That is, it was a seat of idolatry and persecution, and is not in the ancient form, which was pagan, and yet is truly the seat of idolatry and tyranny, though of another sort and form. That's almost difficult to read. But the problem with this line of thinking, in my estimation, is that the descriptors was and is not and yet is, well, they were nowhere to be found in chapter 13. Again, if it's the same beast, what would be the point of not disclosing that before? But concluding once again that most historicist commentators viewed the beast of chapter 17 as the same beast of chapter 13, the beast of the sea. This is the Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary, saying that the time when the beast is not is the time during which it has the deadly wound. The time of the seventh head becoming Christian externally, when its beast-like character was put into suspension temporarily. The healing of its wound answers to its ascending out of the bottomless pit. The beast or anti-Christian world power returns worse than ever, with satanic powers from hell, not merely from the sea of convulsed nations. I find this very interesting because this commentary does what the others have not, which is to weave into the narrative of the chapter 13 beast the bottomless pit. But again, nowhere are we told in that chapter that that beast ascends out of the bottomless pit. In fact, we're told that it rose up out of the sea, which we know alludes to the multitudes of nations or people groups that had moved into the Western Roman Empire when it fell. So the bottomless pit is something we're going to have to contend with, and we will shortly. Let's look at this picture once again, suggesting that the beast that we have been familiar with, the seven-headed beast, which looks like a leopard, has the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. It indeed fits the picture of Revelation 13, that first beast, the beast of the sea. And we remember that he gets his power, his seat, and his authority from the dragon. So again, why make this distinction? Because I believe that this picture of Martin Luther's version of the Whore of Babylon better captures the scarlet-colored beast, and not just because he's got the color right. By using this different picture, I'm suggesting the beast in chapter 17 is a different beast from the chapter 13. In fact, Martin Luther's picture here is more reminiscent of the great red dragon from chapter 12, where we first read about Satan having 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. So far, the description of the red dragon from chapter 12 and the scarlet beast in chapter 17 are practically identical, and in no small way because of their color. Now, I say practically because they both have crowns and kings, and even though that's not the same Greek word, I think it's painting the same picture. I just want to remind you and say again that the body of the beast of the sea has an entirely different description, right? His body is an amalgamation of a leopard, a bear, and a lion. So I like this picture, and I'm going to use it, and I think we're going to find out that this is more in line with what Messiah is conveying to John. But just as a final nail in that coffin lid, so to speak, let's contrast these two beasts one more time. The picture on the left, of course, is the first beast from chapter 13, otherwise known as the beast from the sea. And it was fulfilled when the Roman Empire fell and the Holy Roman Empire arose. It is Daniel who first sees this picture, the 4 Gentile kingdoms which rule the world, and John, I believe, sees this same picture in chapter 13 because it's dealing with that 4th kingdom, Rome. The picture on the right, however, is the beast from chapter 17, otherwise known as the scarlet beast. And if the picture is fulfilled by Satan himself, which we first see in chapter 12, known as the great red dragon, and John alone sees this picture, how does that change things? Well, let me suggest that it's the only way to make this prophecy work. So I officially submit that it is the great red dragon, or Satan himself. And we're going to see if we can bear that out with the other clues that Messiah gives us. Again, you might be asking, does it really matter? Well, I believe it does matter because the rest of the prophecy becomes very problematic if this is the beast of the sea. And that calls into question the prophecy itself, and more so the Word of God. And I feel that we can put that question to rest because really the solution seems simple enough to me, and that's where we're headed. Next, we're told that there are also 7 kings, and there's some small dispute as to whether the text of the previous verse should read, or because of the previous verse, the 7 heads which are mountains, they are 7 kings, and not there are 7 kings. I mean, that rendering would make it clear that the heads are kings, but regardless, I think it's only fitting to mention kings here, juxtaposed to the 7 crowns on the great red dragon. So, who are these kings, or what do they represent? Well, this is where things get really interesting. The historicist camp has generally seen these kings as either 7 forms of Roman government or administration, or as 7 literal world empires or kingdoms. So let's begin as usual with the first possibility and Mr. Barnes. The word kings may be understood so far as the meaning of the word is concerned. A, literally as denoting a king. B, in a more general sense, as denoting one of distinguished honor, a viceroy, prince, leader, or chief. And C, in a still larger sense, as denoting a dynasty, a form of government, and a mode of administration, as what, in fact, rules. He says the principal opinions which have been held may be reduced to the following. 1, that the 7 kings here refer to the succession of Roman emperors, yet with some variation. Or 2, that the word kings is not to be taken literally, but that it refers to forms of government, dynasties, or modes of administration. He says the general opinion among those who hold this view is that the first 6 refer to the forms of Roman government: kings, consuls, dictators, decemvirs, military tribunes, and the imperial form, beginning with Augustus. Well, obviously I have to stop short of Mr. Barnes' lengthy commentary on this portion, but it's easy to Google, and in fact there's a link below if you want to read the entire section. But not only do the majority of historicist commentators go this route, but it quickly becomes evidence that there are huge problems nailing this down exactly. It might be better said, problems aligning this theory with the actual history without having to skip emperors or fudge or massage some of the possibilities. And there isn't a complete consensus in the camp anyway, to which Mr. Barnes himself alludes to. He says, this has been the common Protestant interpretation, and in reference to the 6 forms of government, there has been a general agreement. But while the mass of Protestant interpreters have supposed that the 6 heads refer to these forms of administration, there has been much diversity of opinion as to the 7th, and here he says on this plan of interpretation, the main, if not the sole, difficulty lies. Well, this is a good time to remember that John, or rather Messiah, told us earlier, think this through, don't go too fast. Matthew Henry, he actually highlights the importance of that cautionary advice. Speaking of the 7 kings, 7 sorts of government, he says Rome was governed by kings, consuls, tribunes, decemviri, dictators, emperors who were pagan, and emperors who were Christian. He says 5 of these were extinct when this prophecy was written. 1 was then in being, that is the pagan emperor, and the other, that is the Christian emperor, was yet to come. This beast, the papacy, makes an 8th governor and sets up idolatry again. At first glance, Mr. Henry seems to be making perfect sense here, and many, again, the early commentators, they might differ slightly, but they landed on something very close to this. But it's a matter of having to massage this interpretation, which I don't really like. Do we include the pagan emperors and the Christian emperors together, or are they separate forms of government? I mean, that's just one example of having to fudge these details to make them work. Well, for my money, the Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary from 1871 comes closer to the idea of what is being conveyed here. They say kings is the scriptural phrase for kingdoms, because these kingdoms are generally represented in character by some one prominent head, as Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, Medo-Persia by Cyrus, Greece by Alexander, etc. And next, they give us the first clue that Messiah spoke of. The first 5 of the 7 are fallen, a word, they say, applicable not to forms of government passing away, but to the fall of once powerful empires. Egypt, Assyria, Nineveh, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. Rome, they say, was the one existing in John's day. Now, there can be no disagreement that these 6 powerful empires not only existed, but ruled the world, and in this order. Now, stick with me. I'm going to bring all of this together in one beautiful picture that's going to drive home the fact that we've correctly identified the scarlet beast as the great red dragon. The Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary continues. The 7 heads can hardly be at once 7 kings or kingdoms and 7 geographical mountains. The true connection is that as the head is the prominent part of the body, so the mountain is prominent in the land. Like sea and earth and waters are peoples, so mountains have a symbolical meaning, namely prominent seats of power, especially such as are prominent hindrances to the cause of God, especially Babylon, which they say geographically was in a plain, but spiritually is called a destroying mountain. So in Daniel chapter 2, the stone becomes a mountain, Messiah's universal kingdom supplanting the previous world kingdoms. Well, not only has this commentary reminded us of the symbolic meaning of mountains in scriptures as kingdoms, they go the extra mile and they tell us that these are especially prominent hindrances to God, and I would say to his people. Obviously, Messiah's kingdom, once fully established in the world, is the only exception to that truth. The 7 universal God-opposed monarchies are Egypt, the first world power which came into collision with God's people, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Medo-Persia, Rome, and the Germanic Slavic Empire, the clay of the 4th kingdom mixed with its iron in Nebuchadnezzar's image, a 5th material, symbolizing this last head. Now, when I was researching this, I was at first confused by the name that this commentary gave to the 7th kingdom, the Germanic Slavic Empire. It didn't take much time for me to see, wow, that's really a fitting name. And in a moment when I use the name that we're more familiar with, I hope you have the same epiphany. Well, here are these 2 pictures side by side once again, the left, of course, being those 4 Gentile kingdoms that Daniel saw that better describe the beast from chapter 13, the beast from the sea, because, again, that was important for John to prophesy the fall of the 7th head and its resurrection as the Holy Empire. So this is Babylon, Persia, the 4 Grecian empires, if you will, or sections of the Grecian Empire, and Rome. But the picture on the right, representing the scarlet beast, the great red dragon, and its 7 heads. I mean, from the standpoint of Satan working against God and his people, clearly Egypt was the forerunner of antagonists. And then we saw Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Grecia, and Rome. And if you're counting, that's only 6 world empires. The question mark represents the yet undisclosed 7th king. But we already know the answer. It was the Holy Roman Empire which arose at the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And rather than just lay all that information out, let's be deliberate about connecting it with the actual prophecy. If we numbered these kingdoms, we have the first 5, which at the time John receives the revelation had already fallen away, had already disappeared as empires. Hence, 5 are fallen. And then John is told 1 is. Well, Rome was the empire that existed at the time the revelation was given. And we know already at this point, hindsight teaches us that the 7th was the Holy Roman Empire. But do the clues support that supposition? Well, remember, John told us the other is not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue a short space. This is a good point to remember Voltaire's perspective on the Holy Roman Empire as being neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But for all practical purposes, it was an ever-changing alliance of world kingdoms under the sway of the papal beast. And by all estimates, it existed just over 700 years, which when you compare that with the Roman Empire was a short space. And for these reasons, I am confident that it should be the seventh head of this dragon. But next we have to ask about the eighth king that has been mentioned. So let's look at those clues one more time. The fact that this beast, which was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, the fact that he himself is the eighth king. Again, very important clues. That he comes out of the bottomless pit. Just let's ask ourselves, let's just take a minute. Is there any portion of this prophecy that verifies that Satan will come out of a bottomless pit? Well, I hope you already know the answer. It's yes. At the end of the millennial reign, he will be released from that prison for a short time. And the second clue is that he goes into perdition. Remember, that word just means destruction. And we know that after Satan's final attempt to rally the nations once more, he himself will be thrown into the lake of fire to be destroyed forever. Praise Yah. So these two clues together, I think, confirm the identity of the eighth king, Satan himself. So this list then on the right, clearly being the seven kings mentioned in the prophecy, and Satan, the eighth king. He is of the seven, meaning he was behind every one of those kings or kingdoms, moving them to oppose Yahweh and his people. All of these details nicely fitting the nuanced clues. Without considering these two early empires, you can't make this portion of the prophecy work. Rome wouldn't be the sixth. Okay, Rome was the seventh head on the beast in chapter 13. And from the standpoint, again, of Daniel's four beasts and the Revelation's beast of the sea being an amalgamation of those kingdoms, Egypt and Syria were history. That was behind Daniel, right? And Daniel and John were prophesying of future events. But as part of Satan's kingdom of darkness, seen that way, the inclusion of Egypt and Syria perfectly makes sense. And it makes Rome the current or sixth king, and the Holy Roman Empire the short-lived seventh king, and Satan himself the eighth. The only other player, of course, is the beast of the earth or the papacy, and we've already distinguished that that's who's riding this beast. So in one fell swoop, we have all of the players of Satan's kingdom of darkness in one picture, in the greatest literary work of all time, written, directed, and orchestrated by the great maestro. And let me just say, before I forget, I had mentioned being confused by the name given to this seventh kingdom by one of those commentaries, the German Slavic peoples. The Holy Roman Empire, we learned, was also named, or certainly after 1512, it became the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. And so I think that picture was correct. It was a German people group, if you will. And, I'm still closely looking at that today because, as we'll see, these horns that we're going to talk about in just a moment, though they existed, I believe, early on, there are portions of those still in existence today. Anyway, let's look, because we're told next that the beast has 10 horns, right? And many historicist commentators, remember, they were looking into the future by the time the seventh bowl judgment even came around. So most of them projected these horns into the future as well. And this time we're going to begin with Matthew Henry and his confirmation that the camp wasn't, they were divided at some point with this as well. Speaking of the 10 horns, Matthew Henry says, "That is, as some say, shall not rise up till the Roman Empire be broken in pieces. Or, as others, shall not rise up till near the end of Antichrist's reign, and so shall reign, but as it were, 1 hour with her. But shall for that time be very unanimous, and very zealous in that interest and entirely devoted to it. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown say the 10 kingdoms are not, therefore, 10 which arose in the overthrow of Rome heathen, but are to rise out of the last state of the 4th kingdom under the 8th head. Antichrist is in existence long before the fall of Babylon, but they say it is only at its fall that he obtains the vassalage of the 10 kings. This commentary resolutely refuting the possibility that these horns are precursory to the beast kingdom, insisting it will be much later towards the end of Babylon's fall. Now, far be it for me to suggest that I know better than these studied and time-honored commentators, but I do believe they have added force to the futurist error when looking for modern-day entities to fulfill the prophecies of these horns, because we've seen these 10 horns before. So do their assumptions track? Let's go back to these pictures. The well-established representation of the beast of the sea on the left, and now Nebuchadnezzar's statue. We can begin to understand these horns better. Scripture is clear that these 10 horns already existed on this 4th terrible and dreadful beast of chapter 13. And when Rome received its fatal head wound, before it was reincarnated as the Holy Roman Empire, historical evidence bears out that 10 nations actually assisted in the rise of that papal beast. We've spoken about them before. But I submit that the same entities are represented by the toes, the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. When looking at the statue, which also depicts those 4 Gentile kingdoms, we notice that the 10 toes of iron mixed with clay are at the end, the quote-unquote end of the Roman Empire. Nebuchadnezzar's vision never addresses a fatal head wound to that kingdom or the healing of said wound, because that's all future to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. In fact, remember, at that point, Daniel didn't even know the name of the 4th kingdom. It is Messiah who reveals that kingdom to John as being the Roman Empire. So the 10 toes, in my opinion, are synonymous with the 10 horns. And so now we just have to remind ourselves what their fulfillment was. What does Daniel say about these horns? Well, he told us that the 10 horns were 10 kings, which shall arise, and another shall rise after them. He's going to be diverse, and he's going to subdue 3 of those kings. Hopefully, you better understand now why I have harped on the importance of getting Daniel right in order to understand Revelation. Now, most commentators agree that the little horn that arises and subdues 3 horns is the papacy. Certainly the historicist commentators, right? The man of sin. Note, though, that Daniel is telling us that those 10 horns rise up first, and the little horn rises up after them. And history confirms this very thing. We'll come back to this in just a moment. But when we compare this verse in Daniel to Revelation chapter 17, verse 12, it reads very similarly, but it adds that they reign a short time with the beast. And reminds us that they don't receive any kingdom as yet, but they reign 1 hour with the little horn. It's just not likely, in my opinion, that we should be looking for some union or league of nations today to fulfill this prophecy. Which brings us to Albert Barnes's view that these horns represent the 10 nations that formed after the breakup of the Western Roman Empire, and in which are indeed culpable in that breakup. Anyone can see that, in fact, this is strictly applicable to the governments, as referred to in the notes on Daniel, which sprang up after the incursion of the northern barbarians, and which were finally succeeded by the permanent forms of government in Europe. Catch what he just alluded to. These kings who don't have a kingdom yet are going to eventually be succeeded by permanent forms of government in Europe. I mean, today you can trace most of these horns to some nation in Europe. So they weren't given a kingdom yet. This is, again, explicitly what the prophecy details. They reign a short time without a king. Without a kingdom, excuse me. Next, Mr. Barnes says, even the Romanists themselves admit that the Roman Empire was, by means of the incursions of the northern nations, dismembered into 10 kingdoms. Now, he's relying here on Calmet, who, if you remember, was a Roman Catholic historian and commentator, really, on the book of Revelation, but also on Machiavelli, the Italian statesman and historian. He says neither one of those probably had any design of furnishing an illustration of this prophecy, and probably even had no recollection of it, but they both mentioned these names: the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Sueves and Alans, the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Heruli, the Saxons and Angles, the Huns, and the Lombards. This is also a good place to mention those 3 horns that were plucked up by the little horn. Again, history is pretty clear that as soon as the papacy grew strong enough through the agency of the Eastern Roman Empire, it defeated and somewhat absorbed the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Heruli, nicely fulfilling that part of the prophecy in Daniel. Next, when speaking about these horns hating the whore, and wanting to burn her flesh with fire, Mr. Barnes says, is anything more probable than this? France has already struck more than one heavy blow on that power. England has been detached from it. Many of the states of Italy are weary of it and are ready to rise up against it. And nothing is more probable than that Spain, Portugal, France, Lombardy, and the Papal States themselves will yet throw off the yoke forever and put an end to a power that has so long ruled over people. I just continue to be impressed with Mr. Barnes and these commentators who could already see the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. Most of them, if you remember, died before that 6th bowl judgment of World War I and II. In fact, it was in 1861, just 9 years before Mr. Barnes died, that Italy became a nation and subjugated the Pope to the Vatican City, causing him to lose all of his papal states in Italy and really around the world. You might remember that from our video, Papal Paradise Lost. Well, John Gill agrees with this assessment, but he adds reason to reject the view that these are future kings. Nor are they, he says, 10 kings that will rise up and divide the Roman Empire between them towards the end of the world, which he says is a sense devised by papists to obscure and hide from men the true meaning of the passage. But he says the 10 kingdoms which rose up and into which the Roman Empire was divided upon its being ruined and torn to pieces by the Goths, Huns, and Vandals. Of course, here he's referencing those trumpet judgments. They are the same, he says, with the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image and the 10 horns of the 4th beast or kingdom in Daniel chapter 2. Though this chapter, again, is somewhat a parenthetical chapter, I felt it necessary to cover it in detail because I see a tendency within the historicist camp even today to align with futurist ideas, and I believe that to be not only unnecessary, but quite misleading. So it's important to lay down the understanding that chapter 17, I don't believe, is introducing anything new. It's a composite picture of Satan's kingdom. And that by interjecting new material into the story, you not only change the perspective, you obscure the obvious. This chapter on the whore and the beast is meant to let everyone know exactly who these judgments are coming upon so there can be no mistake. Now, there's obviously no doubt many people will be caught up in this battle, okay, but really, we have to just remember this is judgment against Satan's kingdom of darkness, also known as spiritual Babylon. And that includes all of the earthly kingdoms that have hated Yahweh and his people, beginning with Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Grecia, Rome, the Holy Roman Empire, and let's not forget the other Christ, not to mention the great red dragon, Satan himself. Now, again, when we go forward in time past the millennial, and we're going to be looking at people groups who rise up, who surround when Satan is loosed and he rallies the kings of the earth. We're going to be looking, like we said, at some of the people groups who still exist, but were certainly seeded during this time that we've been talking about today. Every character of this chapter has had predominant roles throughout the Old and New Testaments. And this book of Revelation is no less than the epilogue of the entire Word of God. Just rounding it all out, the bookends, Genesis and Revelation, and everything in between. And this is where we're going to leave it today, and we'll pick back up with chapter 18 next time when we're together and we follow the yellow brick road to find a fool and his money soon parted. We're also going to be looking at several times that Yahweh has broken the bank, so to speak, and discuss how the coming economic collapse could be the mother of all market corrections. Suffice it to say, if you like what you've been seeing lately regarding the crackdown on crime, well, just hold on to your hats because you ain't seen nothing yet. Join me, won't you, for the Book of Revelation, Historicist View, Part 29b, Babylon Bankrupted. But until then, keep studying, keep looking up, because our redemption is drawing nigh. And as always, may shalom reign in your hearts.